Now, detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The 7 mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult the propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Is Turkey looking to reestablish the Ottoman Empire? And how does this impact, Muslim and or Christian eschatology? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining us as a guest we haven't talked to in too long, and that is on me, because he is one of the few gentlemen I know who has actually studied Muslim eschatology and can speak with some academic rigor on this particular topic. He recently wrote an article that relates to this subject, and we'll make that the point of our discussion, or the jumping off point anyway, for the next, for the rest of this program. He's the author of a number of books that we recommend, including 10 Years Captivation with the Mahdi's Camps, Essays on Muslim Eschatology, 2005 to 2015, Sects, Lies, and the Caliphate, and Holiest Wars. He's got a book forthcoming that hopefully we can get an ETA on. And he blogs regularly, by the way, at OccidentalJihadist.com. That's OccidentalJihadist.com. We're pleased to welcome back to the program Dr. Timothy Furnish. Tim, it's good to talk with you again.
Glad to be back, Derek.
You wrote a piece at your site here just a few days ago on some rather tough talk coming out of the mouth of Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Your piece called Talking Turkey About the Mahdi. We've kind of kept an eye on what Turkey's been doing and what President Erdogan has been doing because of what appears to be his geopolitical ambitions. But I guess the question here is how much, well, from your perspective, as an educated observer of the Islamic world and understanding Islamic eschatology, what are Erdogan's ambitions, and how much are those ambitions informed by his understanding of end times prophecy?
Well, heretofore, I had not really thought that Erdogan was operating in any sort of eschatological register, but I think that there's indications here in this article, which is actually it's about a newspaper article, in really what's sort of the quasi-official government mouthpiece newspaper called Yeni Shafak in Turkey. I mean, a lot of people know, and it makes a lot of sense because it's not that hard to figure out, that Erdogan has, I guess, neo-Ottoman aspirations is one way of putting it. This has been talked about for years. I remember even a few years ago there was a cover of the Economist magazine, the British magazine on international affairs, that had Erdogan had his face photoshopped into one of the sultans from the old Ottoman Empire. Now, that may be a little. It may not quite be that. Let's put it this way. That may be a little hyperbolic. I'm not sure he wants to bring back the Ottoman Empire, but it's clear from a lot of the things that he says and does that he thinks that Turkey is by right, I guess, of history, in a certain sense of Islamic theology, Turkey should be the leading power in the Middle East, one of the leading powers in the world. I think he kind of looks at what had been the Arab provinces, in particular of the Ottoman Empire, which are now, of course, Syria and Iraq and places like that, Lebanon, and one could argue even to a certain extent Israel and the Palestinian territories, as sort of Turkey's near abroad. And you remember when for a while after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia used to talk about its so-called near abroad, places like Kazakhstan and things like that. So I think he sort of sees it like that. So I'm not sure it's Ottoman. In a sense, it's certainly neo-Ottoman. He certainly thinks that, as I said, that Turkey should play probably the leading roles in the Middle East. And so I had tended in the past to look at it as purely just a political issue. I don't think he really wanted to bring back the Caliphate, but he certainly saw himself as the leader of the Sunni world over against, say, the Saudis, for instance, and certainly over against the Iranians, who are Shia. But I mean, I think there's there's a lot of indications, at least there's some indications, that I think he may have a, sort of maybe a more Islamically mystical view of things. And again, to get back to this, what I was blogging about, this newspaper article in Yeni Shafak, which is published by some other leading thinkers in the AK party, which is Erdogan's party in Turkey. And it talks, the big issue it talks about is creating Turkey, and to a lesser extent sort of Pakistan, but Turkey in particular, leading the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is the multi, 50-plus member organization that represents on a global stage Muslim countries, at least the leaders of the Muslim countries at any rate. Having that entity create a massive Muslim army most immediately to confront Israel. And the implication is, because it says to liberate Palestine, the implication is basically to eventually bring about the destruction of Israel. And then in that discussion, one of the things that's adduced is this, and I'm sure you know this, and maybe some of your listeners do. It's a bit obscure, but some people that study the topic run across it. One of the hadiths, which is the alleged sayings of Muhammad, not in the Quran, but it's separate collections of supposed sayings of Muhammad, the founder of Islam. There's an eschatological hadith in which it talks about, and it's in actually two of the most authoritative collections of these hadiths, these alleged sayings of Muhammad. And it talks about the eschatological sort of apocalyptic end time battles between Muslims and their opponents, and one of the, if not the major group opposed to Islamic takeover of the world, if you will, before the end of time, will, according to Islamic traditions, will be the Jews. And in fact, there are a number of Islamic hadiths or traditions that say that the Islamic Antichrist, the Dajjal, Dajjal, the deceiver, will be a Jew. But there's also hadiths that talk about, in the course of these end time battles, Jews will hide behind stones or behind trees, and the stones and the trees will speak and say, "Hey, Muslims, there are Jews hiding behind me." Mm-hmm. So this hadith is actually mentioned in this article. This is really kind of striking. Mind you, this is Turkey, okay? This is not Yemen, or this is not Sudan, or this is not some group like ISIS. This is Turkey. This is a publication, Yeni Shafak. This is a publication put out by, university-educated Turks. Not some guys living in some place with Stan at the end of it, trying to hide from American drones. And here they are adducing end-time hadiths to support the idea of the Muslim world allying under the leadership of Turkey against Israel.
Yeah,
it's just very striking.
Well, and disturbing in that Turkey is a NATO ally, which would indicate or suggest, if everybody was to hold up their end of the bargain, if Turkey entered into a military conflict with Israel, that okay, what do we do now? Apparently NATO fractures and we side with Israel, which would be probable, but still that we've got
I suspect it, but that would probably happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Turkey has, people forget this, Turkey's in NATO. It has the second largest army next to the United States.
Yes. And even though the Turks have not, according to some analysts that I've read, and not having military background as you do, I'm kind of limited in how well I can analyze what I'm reading. It doesn't appear that the Turkish army has necessarily covered itself in glory with its recent incursion into Affront province in northern Syria, but still, numbers, the weight of numbers, will cover for a lot of mistakes. So while Israel's got some very high-tech and highly trained soldiers operating that tech at its disposal, boy, when you combine the might, if this were ever to come together, a coalition of the 57 member states of the OIC against Israel would be hard to overcome. It certainly looks, as we were talking before we began recording, that kind of is what Ezekiel was sort of describing in Ezekiel 38:39. I think if we set aside and I don't want to take this into a discussion of eschatology, but essentially in a nutshell, what he's really describing there, the prophet, is the whole world comes against Israel. He's not specifically saying the Ethiopians and the Libyans are going to be part of this army coalition. He said, east, west, north, south, the whole world is coming for this end times battle. Setting that aside, the OIC, what are the chances? I mean, okay, this is what the official government organ of the ruling party in Turkey is putting out there. This is what we good Muslims should do. What are the odds that the rest of the Muslim world says, yeah, we're right behind you?
Not too good right now. Saudi Arabia is clearly more concerned about Iran with good reason. And in fact, and you probably know this, but again, not everybody does, there's really been sort of a de facto covert alliance that's been formed between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Right, yeah.
Because they both are much more greatly concerned about Iran than they are about anybody else. Now, how long that will last into the future, of course, is an open question. But right now, it's be a rather tough road to hoe for the Turks to pull this off. I think a lot of this probably is just for a lot of it is to galvanize Erdogan supporters in Turkey, because in Turkey, he wins elections, the AK party wins elections, but they don't win them overwhelmingly. I think it's safe to say that electorally, demographically, that Turkey, with its 80 million people, is probably about evenly split between supporters of AK and people that don't like AK. But the problem is the opposition is divided into several other parties, and so the AK winds up winning many of the elections. And also, I think it's aimed at sort of ratcheting up his popularity among maybe not the leadership, but a lot of the masses in the rest of the Islamic world. I mean, this sort of thing, I'm not seeing polling data on this, but it would not surprise me at all to see that it goes over well in, to a certain extent, the Arab street. We have something like the Arab street, but, the Pakistani street, for that matter. A lot of the Sunni world, Indonesia, Malaysia. I mean, I believe the Malaysian Prime Minister or Foreign Minister is actually quoted in this article. And in fact, it's interesting. The thing he's quoted about is that to the effect that President Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem is an affront to Muslims. So I think a lot of this is probably aimed at propaganda. Although, if countries started lining up and saying, "Hey, we'll get behind this," I'm sure the Turks wouldn't say no. I can't see it happening in the short term because there's just too many other immediate pressing issues, and Israel is not. Israel, I think, outside of the Palestinians and maybe the Iranians, is not on the front burner of most of the Muslim world's concerns these days. But that doesn't mean in medium to long term it couldn't turn into something. I mean, It's interesting. I mean, I also have a very long blog. If you look on my post, go back, I think it was back in January, where I talked about theocracies and the whole issue of theocracies and this whole thing about the OIC. There is no other regional, transnational entity on the face of the earth that purports to speak for a religious bloc. I mean, there is no longer any sort of Christian alliance in the world. And the only other two religions really that are large enough to even contemplate such a thing would be, of course, the Christian world, and then to a certain extent the Buddhist world. Mm-hmm. There are enough Buddhists across a number of countries. I mean, Hinduism is pretty much just limited to India, so and then none of the other religions are big enough to do it. But there's no organization of Christian countries. There's no organization of Buddhist countries that purport to speak for their individual members on the global stage. But yet, I mean, the OIC has official representation at the United Nations.
Really?
It's like amazing.
Huh.
I mean, if the Christian countries tried to do that, can you imagine the screaming that would ensue?
No. Well, yeah. It's and I'm glad you brought up this article, because I was going to ask you about that, about the significance of the fact that while there is this pan-Islamic political organization, basically a theocratic, or I guess theopolitical would be the word, a theopolitical organization representing Islam. I hadn't realized that they had representation at the UN, and nothing similar to that for any other major religion on the planet. Why is that?
Well, it's because many Muslims still see their primary allegiance is to Islam. It's Islam first, and then to their nation state second. They didn't have without getting into too much into this, but Bernard Lewis has a lot of good stuff on this. If you want to delve into it, particularly with what went wrong and the political language of Islam and a couple of other works. Islam has never successfully disentangled religion and state. The West has largely done it to our positive benefit in many ways, but also to our detriment in many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, frankly, the Christian world is frankly under attack. I mean, you've seen the articles, but even you have organizations like Newsweek admitting that the most persecuted people on the face of the earth are Christians.
Yeah.
But yet the Christian countries cannot come together to do anything about it. In fact, many of them go the opposite way. The European countries, are letting in Muslim, Sweden, Germany, letting in Muslim refugees by the hundreds of thousands, but not Christian refugees. So it's like many majority Christian countries are almost embarrassed by the fact that they're part of Christian civilization. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's a whole lot of more issues to it than that.
And those that aren't like Hungary and the Czech Republic are vilified, and Poland are vilified by the rest of the West.
Right. Well, how atavistic of you to talk about religion being an issue, and meanwhile, Charles Martel and Charlemagne are all spinning like tops in their graves.
Yeah. It is.
Yes, but in the Islamic world, this is still again I think the main allegiance, not for all, but for many Muslims, is Islam first, and then whatever nation state they belong to second. In most of the Christian world, it's the exact opposite. And in fact, even the allegiance of the nation state, as we see with many of the so-called progressives, that's also demonized. So in Islam, it's no embarrassment. It's a major identifier. It's something that unites places like, to a certain extent, places like as far afield as Morocco and Indonesia, and from Sudan all the way up to Turkey and such. So they have something that to some extent brings them together, and they are willing to work together on the international stage to advance its purposes. But yet, the Christian world, for the most part, won't do that. And I also make a remark in this article. This is one reason why, as strange as it may seem, a lot of Americans, I think, a friend of mine said this to me the other day, kind of shocked me, but in retrospect, it shouldn't have. He had been watching that Megyn Kelly interview with Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. And this friend of mine said, I'd vote for that guy. And I was like, really? Vladimir Putin? But he laid out the reasons why. And one of the things he said was, well, at least that guy's trying to defend Christians where they're being killed, mainly, for instance, in Syria. Yeah. And I think, we're starting to get, we're a little better with that with President Trump than we were with President Obama. But where are there any Christian political leaders? Well, I think to a certain extent you did identify a few, but the president of Hungary doesn't have a whole lot of power on the international stage. We're a major Western. We have heard President Trump make a few remarks, and he has changed, I think, the immigration policies such that we are now bringing in more Christians than we are Muslim refugees. So that seems to have been going on. But as far as I know, Putin is the only world leader, political leader of any clout in the last few years has spoken up and said something has to be done to protect Christians that are being killed. Yeah. And a lot of people respect that.
Looking at things as somebody, not only as a student or scholar of Islamic history, Islamic eschatology, but also with military experience, Tim, looking at this friction and what appears to be a desire by political elites here in the West to provoke a conflict with Russia, what is what is the threat from Russia relative to the threat from expansionist Islam? I mean, in other words, I guess what I'm getting at here is, why are we looking to pick a fight with the Russian bear when it seems the two of us have a common cause here in trying to stop what appears to be the third great wave of Islamic expansion?
Well, for Western liberals or so-called progressives, it's simply for domestic political consumption. That's all it is. It's part of the Russia collusion theory, and it's part of their attempt to undermine Trump. I think that's 99.8% of what's going on. I mean, but it's interesting. I had this discussion with conservative friends of mine, and I have to remind them, I'm like, you realize that Putin's not a communist, right? I mean, they don't use that sickle and hammer thing anymore. They got rid of that some years ago. I mean, I just think it's just amusing as all get out, although quite frustrating too, that when the Soviet Union existed, the American left seemed to be very fond of it.
Yeah.
But now that the Soviet Union's gone away and it's gone back to simply Russia, they don't like it anymore. I think it's because, they go to Orthodox churches and they don't like that. But I honestly think it's mostly for domestic political consumption here. I mean, look, on a geopolitical stage, we talk about existential threats. Short term, an existential threat meaning, of course, not that you're reading too much Kierkegaard, but that your existence is threatened, right? In the short term and the medium term, there is no Islamic entity that threatens the existence of the United States, okay? Plain end of story. Mm-hmm. Now, in the long term, in terms of creeping Islamization and, getting enough people into the United States to attempt to change its culture and get to the point where Sharia law is accepted and that sort of thing, I do think that could be construed as an existential threat, and it should be. But in the short term, Russia is an existential threat simply because Russia's got 5,000 nukes aimed at it.
Right.
Well, they probably have a few aimed at the Chinese. Under what possible scenario would the Russians wish to engage in a nuclear war with us? None. Okay, there's none. I mean, Putin can trot out those. I'm not sure they actually exist, but trot out these pictures of these globe-spanning underwater nuclear missiles.
Right.
And
the hypersonic
I'm
missiles.
I'm not sure I really believe those things actually exist, but if they do, why on God's green earth would Putin never want to get in a nuclear war with us? Because it would be the same outcome as it was back when there was the Soviet Union. Except it would probably be even worse for them because they have fewer nukes and our military is more powerful than theirs are. But but it is true that that's an existential threat, right? But again, in terms of, we can argue about, although I don't think there's much of an argument, did Russia try to kind of mess with Americans' heads in the elections? Of course they did. But, as Putin told, I watched part of the interview with Megyn Kelly. As Putin told Megyn Kelly, it's not like we don't do that occasionally.
Sure.
I mean, remember when Obama and the DNC worked against Benjamin Netanyahu in the Israeli elections?
Well, not to mention overthrowing the pro-Russian president of Ukraine. The EU Victoria Nuland statement. Back in 2014. That's right.
Yeah,
it'd be like Russia overthrowing a pro-American president in Mexico. We wouldn't like it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And again, I harbor no illusions about Putin. I mean, I think he's a brutal guy. He's probably ordered people killed. He's not a nice guy. Most world leaders aren't, probably. But does Putin really wish to get into any sort of armed conflict with us? No. Again, I think that the left just likes to push this because they think it corroborates to some extent their Russia collusion narrative, and I think that's why it's done. And meanwhile, but of course, what it does not allow you to do, it allows you to pretend that, as I said, that the actual long-term threat that does exist, which is the influence of Islam in our society and the attempts to change it from within, aren't really an issue to worry about. Where, in matter of fact, I think in the long term, they are a much greater issue to worry about.
Why is that? Is it the tactics, or is it the fact that they're just playing on a longer time scale than most politicians in America?
Both. And I think because many in the West, not all of us, but many in the West think that it doesn't matter what religious ideology is at the core of your civilization. And I think maybe because I'm a world historian, I mean, partly I'm sure because I happen to be a Christian, but also because I'm a historian of world history and of Islamic history, I see that's a profoundly obtuse, frankly, stupid view of the world. There is no country on earth where, frankly, that's majority Muslim that works really well as a democracy. There's just not. And I think a lot of people on the left think that you can just, rather than Athens and Jerusalem, we can just plug in Mecca and Medina and maybe Brussels, and it'll work just fine. But I don't think that's the case. I think that democracy developed out of Western civilization for many good reasons. One of the major, which again, to boil it down to a complex thing to shorthand, Athens and Jerusalem. It was the influence of the Greeks and the Romans. We should probably say Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, but Tertullian got there first. It was Greco-Roman civilization and Christianity, Judeo-Christian thought, along with Greco-Roman thought and practices, that led to the civilization that we have and the sort of democratic republic that we have. That never developed in the Islamic world. It didn't develop in a lot of other civilizations either, but specifically it didn't develop in the Islamic world. And I think when you basically try to change the software, I don't think it's going to work. I think the hardware of our system doesn't work if you change the software from Judeo-Christian to Muslim.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people on the left think that it doesn't make any difference, and I think they're profoundly wrong.
Yeah, I think looking at the history of Iraq since we went into the country there back in 2003 is or Afghanistan in 2001, either one, should be proof. And yet, as George Will pointed out earlier this week, 6,000 days now in Afghanistan, we still don't have a clear objective because they're I have no bloody idea why we're still in Afghanistan. It's insane. Well, this idea of a Muslim democracy, this is something that Mustafa Ataturk tried to create out of the ruins, the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago. What is...
well, he did create a democracy, Derek, but he did it by making it not Muslim.
Right. And I guess that's my question what is
the AK party? Yeah, it's going back to being Muslim, and the more Muslim it becomes, the less democratic it becomes.
Not a coincidence.
That's what Erdogan's doing. I mean, and that's probably, we should have mentioned that earlier. But I think that's a big part of what's going on here is Erdogan, some flashing, Freudian slip there. Erdogan, I think, does in this regard want to go back to sort of a neo-Ottoman approach, which is much less democratic. And that's the direction they're going. So, I don't know, maybe in several centuries, Islam will come to an accommodation where it is possible to be, sort of pluralistic and democratic and have a majority of Muslims. At this point in history, and looking back for the last 14 centuries of Islamic history, it really hasn't worked. I mean, I've changed my mind on this a little bit. There was a point, I wrote some stuff a few years ago where I thought, well, the Ottomans could have turned into a democratic system if the attempts to set up, they actually in 1876 and toward the end of the 19th century tried to set up a sort of a constitutional democracy, a constitutional monarchy with the Sultan ruling in tandem with a parliament they set up, an Ottoman parliament they set up. But it only lasted about a year or so, and then the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, shut down the parliament, and it was held in abeyance for about 30 years. So when Ataturk came along later, of course, after World War I, he was one of the few Ottoman generals that was competent in World War I. Mm-hmm. And the Ottoman state still existed, and he led basically the revolution that overthrew it. But the system he set up was in no wise an Islamic state or Islamic republic. It was a majority Muslim country, but he totally separated mosque and state, and that's how it functioned. It was a decent. I mean, they had to have a few military coups in there to straighten things out, but it was more or less a decently quasi, at least, democratic republic until the 1990s. And then the AK party, which is Erdogan's party, started coming to power, and one of the mainstays of the AK party was that Turkey had become too secular. It needed to go back to its Muslim roots. Mm-hmm. And then we see, therefore we now see, we see Erdogan becoming increasingly autocratic. I wouldn't say he's a dictator yet. I mean, he has won elections, but I don't know that we'll ever see him go out of office. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, they've been making some noise recently, and just bring the conversation here just to look at short-term goals for Turkey. They have issued some threats against, and there have been some confrontations in the Aegean between Turkey and Greece. Some of us are just barely old enough to remember Turkey and Greece getting into it over the island of Cyprus back in the 70s. Also, Erdogan, well, again, as we mentioned earlier, they've got that military incursion into northern Syria right now, and now talking about possibly going into northern Iraq to take care of the Kurds, which is something that the government in Baghdad wouldn't mind much. But Erdogan has not really been too respectful of the government in Iraq either, basically telling the prime minister there to know his place and you're not on my level, that sort of thing. Again, is this all part of a drive toward restoring the Ottoman Empire to its glory?
I think that's part of it. I think, to be fair to the Turks, they do have legitimate concerns about Kurdish irredentism. For your listeners that don't know this, the Kurds are, I'm pretty sure, the largest group of people in the world that don't have their own state. There's about 30 million Kurds. The Kurds they're not the same as the Arabs. They're not the same as the Persians. I think they're probably linguistically a little closer to Persians than they are to anybody else, but Kurdish is a separate language. Kurds are mostly Sunni, but for the most part, with very, very few exceptions, they're pretty moderate Muslims. But they don't have their own state. They got basically the short end of the stick at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire broke up. And so they're large. The Kurds live in Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq for the most part. But the largest, I guess, the plurality of them, the biggest single chunk of them live in Turkey. Something like 15 to 20% of the population of Turkey is Kurdish, mainly in the south and east. And the Turks do have legitimate concerns because of the PKK, which has fought against them for years and tried to break away that part of Turkey to make a separate Kurdish state. The Turks have legitimate concerns about the Kurds doing this. And the group that they're always going after in Syria is called the YPG, and it's a Kurdish acronym, and I can never remember what it means. But it's the Syrian branch of the PKK in Turkey.
Yeah.
And this is this fighting in Affront that you brought up, which is where they're going after them. So, I mean, the Kurds also, however, from our point of view, have been arguably the most stalwart opponents of ISIS in the Middle East. And the Kurds, with the possible exception of the Israelis, and sometimes I think maybe even surpassing the Israelis, are about the most pro-American people over there. So we have this, really complex situation where Turkey, who is a NATO ally and gets most of its weapons from us, is fighting a group of people that we are basically officially supporting against ISIS, and a group of people whom we also, of course, support their autonomy, if not their absolute independence in northern Iraq. So it's a very complex situation. But clearly it's gone beyond, for the Turks, it's gone beyond just concerns about the Kurds and as I said, their irredentism, their wish to sort of unite the different Kurdish regions in the different countries into what you, as you correctly observed, basically this idea, this sort of neo-Ottoman idea that that, especially as you pointed out, vis-a-vis sort of his verbal smackdown of the Iraqi president, the Iraqi prime minister, Erdogan's and the AK party very much had this idea that, as I said when we opened up here, that if it's not really bringing back the Ottoman Empire, it's pretty close in terms of, well, Turkey is the superpower in the Middle East, and the rest of you should just shut up and do what we want.
Well, it's interesting stuff, and just as a historic and from the cosmological research that I've been doing, that region, Turkey, has had more influence on world history and world religions than we would like to believe. Sharon is doing a lot of research for her series, The Red Wing Saga, and she was researching the Celtic Horned God Cernunnos today, or Cernunnos, and we found to the best of our ability, we could trace the origins of that thing back to Anatolia and the Galatians, who probably got it from the Hittites and the Hurrians and the Luwians, who were next door neighbors of the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Akkadians, and so forth. Trace it all the way back to, we basically wound up tracing it more or less back to Babylon. There's a horned god component there, and when you look at there's a scholar from the University of Edinburgh who links the chief Canaanite god El, who is referred to as with the epithet the bull El in many texts, and even in the Bible once or twice. But then goes on to point out that the name of the chief Titan of Greek mythology, who is identified as El, the chief of the Canaanite gods, that the etymology of the name Kronos actually comes from a Ugaritic, Akkadian, and, basically a Semitic root word that is very much like Kronos, that means horns. So you've got this sort of bovid imagery connected to this god that winds up in Ireland by way of, ancient, the Holy Land, basically. So it's, and it all moved from east to west through what is now Turkey. So.
Yes, but of course, keep in mind that the Turks didn't come until close to the end of the first millennium AD.
That's true. Different people groups, right?
The Turks came from Central Asia. They're actually related to the Mongols. In fact, we often speak in linguistic terms. You speak of Turco-Mongol languages like Uralic and Altaic and Mongolian. So the Turks are very much latecomers to that region, and sort of circle back around to kind of what we were talking about a bit ago. Remember that was the Byzantine Empire. That was the Eastern Christian Roman Empire until the Turks marched in. Well, I mean, it wasn't the Ottomans. At first, it was another group of Turks called the Seljuks.
Right.
But who started the process. But then it was the Ottomans who, of course, finished off the Byzantine Empire. So I've often wondered, why it's okay for certain groups to call for certain areas back, but it's not okay for Christians to demand back Istanbul or Constantinople, let us say.
Yeah, exactly. And when we start talking about reparations, Sharon and I like to joke that between her Scots-Irish ancestry and my Welsh, English, Swedish ancestry, we represent, and German ancestry, we basically represent all of the stakeholders in what is now Great Britain. So we'd wind up paying ourselves reparations, I suppose.
Those Norman French owe you.
That's it. Except that they were Vikings from Sweden too, so my Swedish ancestors are still part of that whole deal. And the first Russians, the Kievan Rus, who founded what became the Kingdom of Russia back in the 9th century, also Vikings from Sweden. So
the Varangian Guard.
The Varangian, yes, right. Exactly, who fought multiple wars against the Byzantines. Yeah, and South.
But then eventually went to work for the Byzantines.
Right. Yeah. Well, you get a better offer.
That's right.
You change sides.
The emperor gives you an offer you can't refuse.
The medieval equivalent of academy.
Right.
Dr. Timothy Furnish, the author of multiple books. If you want to better understand Islamic eschatology, get his book, 10 Years Captivation with the Mahdi's Camps. You can find it at Amazon. I'll put a link in the show notes at VFTB.net. If you're watching this on YouTube, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert, look below the video. Notes there, link there as well. Tim, I saw in your site at occidentaljihadist.com a reference to a forthcoming book, perhaps?
Yes, God willing. I was hoping to have it done toward the end of the year, but then teaching got the better of me, as did my sons in high school football, who, by the way, I should mention that their team won the state 4A championship here in Georgia, the team they play for, Blessed Trinity Catholic High School.
Excellent.
But yes, this book, God willing, it will be out in May. It's called Enemies of the Caliphs, and basically it looks at the Ottomans, mainly at the Ottomans, speaking of the Turks. It looks at the Ottomans and how the Ottomans fought counterinsurgency, how the Ottomans fought against, they have 6 different groups, basically, that either rebelled against or fought some sort of guerrilla war against the Ottoman Empire between the basically 14th and early 20th centuries. And I'm just looking at how they dealt with this, and some of these groups, in fact, were very similar to ISIS. And so it's sort of a policy wonky kind of book. It's mainly history, but it's saying, well, we a lot of the literature, a lot of the ideas today that are coming out about how we deal with groups like ISIS take the Cold War as a model for us. Well, we defeated the Soviets, therefore we defeat ISIS or global Islam or whatever you want to call it, jihad like that, which I think partially works, but kind of what I'm going to get at in this book is that the Ottomans dealt. Let's look at how a major Islamic state dealt with Islamic enemies, because frankly, some of our allies, like Saudi Arabia, are Islamic states, and we probably politically want to keep them as allies for a while. So I behoove us to look at how an Islamic state could defeat an Islamic insurgency and see how that works. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. Again, it's called Enemies of the Caliphs, and it should be out on Amazon by, God willing, May.
Well, we'll talk again when that's out, because that sounds like that'll be very instructive for those who choose to learn from history rather than be steamrolled by it once again. So we appreciate your time and joining us today, Tim, and look forward to talking with you again.
All right, Derek. Thanks a lot.
Again, see the show notes below this video or at VFTB.net or Spreaker.com or Stitcher.com or wherever else you find this particular podcast, because I have linked to Tim's website, OccidentalJihadist.com. Plus, I'm going to make sure that I get the Amazon link to 10 Years Captivation with the Mahdi's Camps, available in paperback and in Kindle. And that one in particular was very instructive. The differences between Sunni eschatology and Shia eschatology are huge. You can't really understand what's going on in the Islamic world if you don't understand what they believe about end times prophecy. And the fact that there is this pan-Islamic theopolitical organization and no corresponding organization for Christendom or for Buddhistdom is important as well. So again, Tim is a valuable resource, and been too long since we've had him on the program. Coming up on this program, because of the timely nature and rather time-sensitive nature, I've kind of shuffled the schedule, and my apologies to the guests for the upcoming couple of shows, because I told them they would be coming up a week earlier than they are now, because I'm juggling the schedule to facilitate, to squeeze this interview in right away. Coming up then on the 25th of March, instead of Judd Burton, as I originally thought, Carl Tykrib, who was originally going to be broadcast in this time slot. So Carl Tykrib, coming up next week, we'll be talking with him about his forthcoming book, Game of Gods, the Temple of Man in the era of reenchantment, age of reenchantment. I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like that, and I'll get that right when we actually get to the program. But you'll hear that and see that program, that interview, recorded here in this very room on March the 25th. And April 1st, our discussion with Dr. Judd Burton. He's got a new book coming out called The Nephilim Dossier. The term dossier getting a lot of use in political realm these days, so I think a good choice for him on his book title. But his research and mine tracking very closely now on the importance of the giants, the Nephilim, the Rephaim, in not just the ancient world, but today, because they've had more influence, more impact on biblical theology than we were taught. And this is the whole premise behind Dr. Michael Heiser's book, Reversing Hermon, the importance of the Genesis 6 incident, the Mount Hermon incursion, if you will, on New Testament theology. Well, Judd digs deeper into his research, and we kick around some things that I've got coming up in my forthcoming book, which, God willing, will be out in August, which shows how important the giants, the men of renown, will be prophetically. And it's not talking about a literal return of, giants, but their spirits are still with us. Okay? If we accept the premise that demons emerged from the Nephilim, who were destroyed in the flood, they're still with us, and they have a role yet to play, according to the Bible, in my understanding of it. And then William Ramsey, author of a couple of very important books that we've dealt with here, one regarding the West Memphis Three, Damien Eccles and his conspirators. Conspirators, not quite the right word, but Anyway, a horrific crime that was committed in West Memphis years ago, for which Damien Eccles received a massive outpouring of support from Hollywood, believe it or not. He has been released from prison and now on probation, but he is still walking the streets free. Anyway, William Ramsey released a film. He's making documentaries now last year that escaped my attention at the time. But it's about a subject that Sharon and I noticed a few years ago on PID radio. It's called The Smiley Face Killers. This is about the mysterious disappearance of up to 100 young men across the northern United States, but also as far away as England and in Europe, in Spain in particular. Healthy young men, most between the ages of 19 and 28, who disappear and are later discovered in bodies of water. And in almost all cases, the authorities write it off as an accidental death, a drowning, perhaps, even though in some cases the young men were missing for 4 or 5 weeks before they were found, and were found in some cases in bodies of water that had already been searched, which meant that between the previous search and the search in which they were found, the bodies were placed there. And they didn't show 4 or 5 weeks worth of decay. It's a creepy story, and you'll hear the significance of the smiley face in all of this when we bring you that interview with William Ramsey on April the 8th. We're just a week away, in fact, less than a week away. Sharon and I will be heading to Dallas on Thursday of this week for the Hear the Watchman Conference. Iron Sharpens Iron. It's a Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center. I assume that if you were going, you'd already have made your plans because getting in at this point might be difficult. I know the hotel is sold out, the Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center, but you can bring the conference to you through a video stream, high-definition video, straight to your living room. And we can save you 20% off the cost of that. 20% off the stream to watch speakers like Carl Gallups, L.A. Marzulli, Bill Salas, Josh Tolley, Coach Dave Daubenmire, Pastor Casper McLeod, Mark Taylor, co-author of the Trump Prophecies, will be there. I'll be speaking. Carl Gallups and I get to launch the conference again this year. Carl first, I get to bat second. And again, 20% off the video feed using the promo code Gilbert20. That's Gilbert20 at hearthewatchmen.com. And then this fall, the True Legends Conference returns to Branson. This year's theme, Transhumanism and the Hybrid Age. That's September 14th through the 16th at the Mansion Theater in Branson. Steve Quayle, Tom Horn, Sharon K. Gilbert, Dr. Hugo DeGaris, and others speaking on, a movement that wants to redefine literally, physically, biologically, what it means to be human. Don't wait, because as I understand it, they've already sold out half the theater. And because of fire code regulations, we can only admit 3,000 people maximum. So it's already half gone, and we're still 6 months out from the conference. Don't wait. For information and registration, log on to gen6.com. That's GENSIX.com. We do a weekly Bible study, Sharon and me, and we usually post the study. It's about 1 hour long each. It's an audio study. We post it by midday Sunday. We're into the book of Ezekiel now, so we're getting into some really meaty stuff. Not that there's anything that's not meaty in the Bible, but Ezekiel, oh, Nelly. You'll find that at gilberthouse.org. That's gilberthouse.org, and all the archives going back to Genesis 1:1 are posted there. Coming up on Skywatch TV next week, for the next 2 weeks, interviews with Dr. Michael Heiser. Skywatch TV is now on some new national networks, and so we wanted to introduce Mike Heiser to the folks who watch GEB America, the Impact Network, and Angel One. So Mike Heiser for the next 2 weeks with Josh Peck and me, talking about Reversing Hermon, the Book of Enoch, and other such topics. You'll find the complete schedule and where and when you can watch and hear Skywatch TV posted at skywatchtv.com. Just check the top menu bar where it says Watch Skywatch TV. A View from the Bunker is available wherever fine podcasts are sold. iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker.com, and other places. Please give us a review, give us a like, and give us a like on Facebook. Facebook.com/View from the Bunker, which is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is by Kevin MacLeod. His website is incompetech.com. The opening announcer, our friend D.C. Good. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.